In just a little while, towards the very end of our worship service this morning, you and we are all going to be invited to stand and in unison recite our closing affirmation. Most of us know it by heart, I think, at this point, and for those of you who don't, it is printed on the front of your order of service. Eric spoke it just a few minutes ago. Our congregation is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our diversity, beneath all our differences, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. And then we will be invited to pause briefly in silence in witness to that unity. Last summer, I was talking with the Reverend Betty Pingle, and she asked me about the closing affirmation. She liked it, she said. She got all that stuff about the unity beneath the diversity and all that stuff about time and death, but she didn't get the part about the space between the stars. What was that doing there? She wanted to know. And would I please, on some upcoming Sunday, explain why we say that and what we mean by it? Yes. I would. Today is that day. And I'm going to approach the space between the stars from a couple of different angles. And by the way, it is not an accident that this Sunday, when I'm going to explore the space between the stars, happens in a month when our whole soul living theme is divinity. Because my first approach to the space between the stars is going to be with a little bit of very accessible theology. So we live in a world where science has come to understand quite a bit about the space between the stars. And the findings of modern science have not been kind to traditional theology or to traditional notions of God that come with that traditional theology. In so many ways, we truly live in a whole new age. Consider that the space between the stars is unimaginable. And I don't mean like difficult to imagine. I truly mean unimaginable. So to work with that idea just a little bit, let's start very small. Remember all those diagrams that you've seen of the solar system? All those ones that show the sun in the middle and all the planets lined up neatly in concentric circles around it. Every one of those that you've ever seen is hopelessly wrong. And I mean hopelessly wrong because you just can't accurately draw the solar system in any kind of meaningful way. Let's try anyway, just as an exercise. So let's begin by imagining that the Earth is about the size of a pea, which would probably be about the actual size that it might be shown if it was in a book or in one of those National Geographic fold-out pages. So imagine that the Earth is about the size of a pea. To keep the scale and distances accurate, Jupiter would be about the size of a softball, but it would be over 1/5 of a mile away. About 3 blocks from here, like down around 14th and 11th or so. So that's the real scale we're talking about. Here's the Earth the size of a pea, and down on 11th Avenue is Jupiter about the size of a softball. Now on that same scale, the planet Pluto would be smaller than a grain of sand. Would be smaller than a grain of sand, and it would be about 1.5 miles from here, which would be about like on Colorado Boulevard. So, like, here's the Earth, about the size of a pea. Pluto about the size of a grain of sand on Colorado Boulevard. You can't draw this. in any kind of meaningful way. Keeping to this, and that's just our solar system, right? Keeping to this same scale, the nearest star to us would be about the size of a large beach ball or like an exercise ball. But in order to find it, you would have to travel 10,000 miles, about the same distance you would travel over the surface of the earth to get to Tokyo. That's Japan. And that's just the nearest star. So our galaxy has over 100 billion of those. And by all accounts, the universe has about 140 billion galaxies. So it doesn't take very long before these numbers are like kind of white noise in the background. You simply can't imagine those numbers and those larger distances, no matter how hard you try. About the time that the early Christians were writing down the ideas that would become known as theism and traditional Christian doctrine, no one had any idea of this notions of these kinds of scales. Remember the book of Genesis from the Bible. God created the universe in 6 days, separated the land from the water, the light from the dark, populated the earth with animals, and created humankind in God's own image. Notice that there is no real spatial thinking in that passage, anywhere in that passage. It just wasn't an issue. And all of this is really a rather long way of saying that while the theology from the book of Genesis might have made perfect sense for our ancestors, it's a pretty hard case to make today. And that's what I mean when I say modern science has not been kind to traditional theology. The space between the stars means that a lot of the old bets are just off when it comes to theology. Last week I mentioned that the poet Joe Pintaro once wrote that to believe in God is to believe that something somewhere isn't stupid. And on that note, it is worth mentioning that the great, and in my opinion, great, and imaginary English philosopher Monty Python has also weighed in on this subject. Monty Python wrote, "Whenever life gets you down, Mrs. Brown, and things seem hard or tough, and people are stupid, obnoxious, or daft, and you feel like you've had quite enough, just remember that you're free." I'm sorry. Just remember that you're standing on a planet that's evolving and revolving at 900 miles an hour, orbiting at 19 miles per second. So it's reckoned round the sun, which is the source of all our power. The sun and you and me and all the stars that we can see are moving about 1,000,000 miles a day in a minor spiral arm at 90,000 miles an hour in a galaxy we call the Milky Way. Our galaxy is made up of 100 billion stars. It's 100,000 light years side to side. It bulges in the middle, 16,000 light years across, but about by us it's just 3,000 light years wide. We're 30,000 light years from galactic central point. We go around every 200 million years. And our galaxy is only one of millions and billions in this amazing and expanding universe. our galaxy, our universe keeps on expanding and expanding. In every direction it can whiz. The speed of light, that's as fast as it can go. 12 million miles a minute, that's the fastest speed there is. So remember, when you're feeling rather small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely was your birth. And pray that there's intelligent life somewhere up in space, 'cause there surely isn't any here on Earth. A minister can wait a long time for an opportunity to do something like that. More seriously, contemplating the space between the stars can make existence feel very small, very insignificant, and very... Remember that picture of the Earth from space. The truth is that we live on this very tiny, very fragile, very unimaginably isolated little ball of rock. And I appreciate having the space between the stars in our closing affirmation because of that reminder, and especially because of that central proposition, this affirmation that there is something that binds us together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. The second approach I'd like to take to the space between the stars is more poetic and metaphorical. The Reverend Victoria Safford, whose work I greatly admire, wrote a short meditation as follows. If I were asked to confess my faith and my beliefs out loud, and I were scrambling for some place to begin, I would start in the desert, in the lonesome valley, and say that first of all and ultimately we are alone. No God abides with us, caring, watching, mindful of our going out or coming in. The only certainty is mystery. We are alone, and because we are alone, it is the chance connections, both chosen and involuntary, that matter most of all and ultimately help and heal and hold us. We are alone yet inextricably bound, inextricably connected to soil and stream and forest, to sun and corn and melting snow. We are alone yet bound by stories we cannot get out of, to ancestors and descendants we will never meet. And all of these natural conditions, these bonds we did not forge ourselves, and yet cannot deny, are the strands of a theology, the seeds of faith, the beginning of religion, of binding all things. When I say God, and sometimes I do, because sometimes there is no other metaphor, no other symbol, no other poetry, no other offering. When I say God, I mean that place of meeting, that place where solitudes join. The space between my hand and that dogwood, the space where the tiny feet of the ant brush the dry dirt beneath her, the space between Mercury and Venus, between electrons, which we unblinkingly believe in without seeing. God is the space in between, the bridge between solitudes, the ground where we meet, you and I, or any two, by grace. If I were asked, I'd say that all of us together are alone, and the emptiness between us is waiting to be filled. One of the things I so appreciate about Safford's meditation is her use of language. It's that sometimes there is no other metaphor, no other symbol, no other poetry, no other prayer to express that creative mystery where solitudes join. And I wondered, as I thought about this sermon, I wondered if I could pull all these together in some kind of meaningful way. Safford's metaphor of the spaces between things, our closing metaphor of the space between the stars, and the very real perceived spaces that separate us, you and I, and each of us from the other. Thinking about this led me back to Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher and theologian and peacemaker from the 1920s and 30s. And he wrote that there are essentially two ways that we approach each other as human beings, our relationships. We can approach each other, or we can approach other people as if they were an it. That is, a thing, a finite object to be manipulated or endured or persuaded or feared or controlled or sold to or purchased from. And he calls this an I-it relationship, and holds that this is generally what we do with each other. Or he says we can approach other people as if they were a thou, a you. Another deeply mysterious, learning, striving, loving, struggling fellow consciousness whose longing for connection and wholeness is just as deep and occasionally just as confused as ours is. He calls this an I-thou kind of a relationship. And Buber says that on those rarefied and wonder-filled occasions when we are able to achieve this in a mutual sense, that is, when the space that separates us becomes the space that connects us, alive and electric, with the power of something none of us can create alone, then this I-thou moment becomes more than two people in relationship, but that something else enters that space as well. A sense of presence, a qualitative reality that both people create between them and respond to. And he goes further than that, too. He says Buber says that when two or more beings meet each other in wholeness, when souls are truly shared, that relational space creates the opening into which the divine can enter. In other words, if there is such a thing as a divine, and if the divine comes into our human experience, Buber says, this is the way that we touch it. This is the way we participate with it. This is the way we invite it in to us. I have experienced just enough moments like that to find tremendous meaning in the possibilities of this idea, this reality, and I hope that you have too. And I wonder if we could come to see this idea in the metaphor of our closing affirmation. That is, that the space between the stars is a symbolic way of talking about the space that separates human beings from each other, separates us from creation, separates us from the divine. And what we affirm each week is that there is a unity that underlies and binds us together in spite of that space, in spite of those perceived distances. These days, when people ask me what our church is about, I tell them that we're dedicated to the proposition that there's a unity that makes us one, and that all souls, every one of them, are sacred and worthy. Those are propositions. I'm careful that I don't call them doctrines or creeds, but they're a core proposition. I tell them, if they're still listening and still curious, I tell them that historically we come from a theological tradition that believed that whatever the divine was, whatever that creative force of the universe might be, it was better represented by a unity than by a trinity or some other arbitrary division. I say that in this tradition we boldly and earnestly invite people to bring their minds along on their spiritual journey, and that we live in a world where our best and brightest scientists are now telling us that the universe really is a unity. And that our best understanding of reality is that at every level, everything that is, everything we are, can in fact be understood as overlapping fields of energy. At the most basic level, an expanding field of infinite possibility that has come together and somehow created you, us, life, consciousness, art, music, Monty Python, bacteria, spiral nebula, birds in flight. I tell them that now we have modern theology, in the same way that we have modern science. And modern theology tells us that whatever the divine is or might be, whatever that creative energy or source or force might be, it is not separate from us. It is not separate from the universe. It is built into every atom, every reality, every interaction, every star, every thought that any being ever had. And I say that this, in my opinion, in my experience, allows us to see the divine in everyone, even in those we do not love, even in those we don't even like. And this makes us better human beings and opens up possibilities for the human spirit that we have not yet explored. And this is why I'm a Unitarian Universalist in spite of everything, in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. Amen.